Jennifer. That was a lot of work. Thanks for explaining all of that. I am so happy to be here. Half my family is at home with a stomach flu today, and I just woke up this morning, crossed my fingers, and thought, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to be fine. I can get sick after the symposium, so I'm super glad to be here. Before I introduce myself, I want to say something about the Learning Roundtable. They're basically sponsoring this event. And then I'll go ahead and introduce myself, the symposium and the session. But the Learning Roundtable, it's an organization within the American Library Association, and it's a terrific place for learning professionals in libraries to connect with and learn from each other. And you can see here on this slide a little bit about the mission of the group, promoting continuing ed, being a source for staff development, training, and activities, and thirdly, being an advocate for staff development and continuing ed. So it's just a really awesome group. So if you're not involved with it at this point, go check them out at that link. Let's see, the other thing I want to say about, let me see if I can, oh, yep, I got it forwarded. The other thing I want to say about the Learning Roundtable is that we have a couple events coming up at ALA. We hope to see you there. The first is a pre-conference, and the other is just a regular program, and you can read about them here. You can go check out the link. Jennifer is putting them up on in the chat window, so thank you. So if you're going to be at ALA, we really hope to see you there. Okay, so that's about the Learning Roundtable. Let me say a little bit about this, the symposium and the session. And first, I forgot to say hello, everybody, and I would love to hear who you are, where you're from, and if you could just start putting that in the chat box, that would be really fun to kind of just see where everybody is distributed. We've got over 100 people here today. It's so awesome. So go ahead and introduce yourself, just kind of where you're from, maybe your library, and then as you do that, I'll talk a little bit about myself, so let's forward on. So I'm a librarian from way back, it feels like way back. I started at the University of Arizona Library in the mid-90s, and then I came up here to the University of Minnesota, where I've had just a series of roles, all involved in teaching and in learning and training. I started here as the distance learning instruction librarian, then I became the user education coordinator, then I became the director of coordinated educational services, and now my focus is on staff. Staff, our groups, and our organizational development work. So training and development continues to be a key part of my work, but now it's more geared towards staff. I'm also the author of this book up here, Creating the One-Shot Library Workshop, and I've trained all over the country on how to apply instructional design principles and techniques to libraries of all types. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm watching all this cool chat go by with introductions. So wow, that's great. Thank you for doing that. Maryland, Washington, North Carolina. This is great. Thank you. Wow, we're really all over the place. Pittsburgh, Indianapolis. All right. Woo. Okay, so let me say something about the symposium next. Why are we doing the symposium? It came from, it was kind of a rub for me. It started where in my library, and maybe in your library, your organization, this is true for you too, but in my library, historically, we've had traditionally, we have this experience that is, I would call it an endemic of undermanagement, and you may be able to relate to this. Undermanagement is when we end up promoting people into management basically as a recognition of their subject matter expertise. So in other words, they're, they might be a great e-resource management specialist, or they've handled their ILL duties very well, or whatever, and then we promote them into management because that's a way for us to recognize people for their competence and their skills, and it's also usually the only way to give them increases in their salary. But for a lot of them, they're not necessarily aspiring to be in management positions. They don't necessarily feel comfortable managing their friends and other peers, and often they want to continue to do what they're really good at, their subject matter expertise. So all these things mean sometimes that the management aspect of their job can get downplayed, and too much of this kind of thing ends up resulting in a culture of undermanagement across the libraries, across our institutions. So years ago, we decided to address this head on, and we started offering a lot of supervisor and leadership training. And since I've really made a difference here in our library around under management. But you know, I've been doing this kind of work in isolation, putting on these programs, designing them, partnering with outside experts, but I've been doing it kind of on my own, and I started to think, gosh, there's got to be a lot of people out there in my situation who are working to create training and development pretty much on their own with no colleagues doing the same work that they have access to. So I created this survey, I have this up on the slide, and asked folks in the Learning Roundtable list if they'd be interested in attending this kind of an event, and some people said, sure, yeah. And so several of the responders to the survey, they volunteered to help out. And so here we have today's symposium, and there are 3 of us who are pretty much the core volunteers, and you'll get to meet the other 2 a little later in the symposium, Heather Sostrom and Sandra Smith. And then we had a few other very lovely people who volunteered to help deliver some of the sessions, and you'll get to hear from them later this afternoon. So thank you, everybody who's been able to work on this. All right, so that's a little bit about the symposium. This session that I'll be doing, oops, the slide didn't quite, well, you get it, session 1. The first one that I'll be doing addresses the how of supervisor development. So we're going to look at what are the approaches, tools, the techniques that you might use to help you create a program in such a way that works for your target learners. And then in the second session, we'll focus on the what of supervisor development. And in this session, you'll learn about actual real-life supervisor development programs that have worked, that you can borrow from and you can adapt. And then in our third session today, we're going to be covering the why of supervisor development, and you'll learn how you could position supervisor development so that it is an easy sell, both at the organizational level and at the individual level. So that's kind of what's in store for us this afternoon. And during all of these sessions, we encourage you to use the learner guide. There was a link to that here in the chat. You also got it in your email. The learner guide is basically a way to keep focused on what we're talking about during the sessions. So do take some time to jot down some of your answers so you have something really tangible to take away with you after this symposium is over. Thank you, Jennifer. She just put a link to the guide there. Okay, so we also have some other handouts too that I'll want to just mention. The big one that we have is our experts guide. So during the symposium, we didn't just want you to have to hear from our own individual experiences and our own advice. We wanted to bring multiple voices to the symposium. So we went out and asked just a slew of what we consider experts in supervisor development in libraries to contribute their thoughts. So these folks are consultants, they're regular trainers on supervisor development in libraries. They're kind of our experts in the field. And so you'll see in this handout, I guess it was about 7 or 8 people whom we tapped. And if you go to the end of the handout, I think it's page 7 or 8 towards the end, you're going to see all the experts we tapped, all their comments together on one page. So you'll see people like Deanna Jones and Kimberly Sweetman and Linda Bruno and a number of people there. And I just want, if you've got that handout open, just take a look at that, flip down through to the end of it where we have all the individual people listed. And I'm curious if you could type in the chat box here, has anyone out there, have you contracted or worked with any of these folks? And do you have anyone else you'd recommend? Because you know, if we do have enough sort of collective advice and collective wisdom here on this webinar, it'd be really awesome to be able to come back to this chat and find those names. So if you have worked with them or you'd recommend somebody else with whom you've partnered to provide supervisor development programs, cool, just stick them in the chat window, and that way we'll have a record of it for others. Let's see, we have listed here underneath the experts handbook or the guide and 3 other handouts. So the one that I'm going to be referring to is the Understanding Your Learners. So if you would also kind of have that at the ready, that would be great. And I'm not seeing anything in chat, which is sort of interesting. Well, so you do have a list of our experts in case you do want to contact someone else, one of them, or follow with one of them to either collaborate with or contract out for some of your development. All right, great. So let's go into this session, the how. Oops, let me forward the slide. Come on. Okay, the how of supervisor development. Let me grab a drink. Okay, so for the rest of the hour, this is what we're going to be looking at on best practices and techniques for supervisor development, but I have to point out what seems maybe kind of obvious, but maybe not, and that is that supervisor development in and of itself is a best practice. And it's probably the best how of them all. So how do you reduce undermanagement and hopefully even eradicate it? How do you build a strong supervisory culture? Well, just the act of announcing your programs to your staff, just the act of encouraging supervisors to participate, just the act of resourcing supervisor development is a best practice in and of itself. And just 6 years ago, we did none of this. Maybe you can relate. But I can tell you that the power of just the offering is phenomenal. And it sends a really strong message that there is a certain skill set, that there is a certain set of activities that supervisors are responsible for. And it sends the message that supervisors need to develop, that we want them to develop, that they should indeed be developing. And they don't have to do it on their own or haphazardly or rely solely on their supervisor to teach them how to be a great supervisor. So, I know a lot of people are thinking, well, of course, Geraldine, but but I know that there are probably others in this group who are thinking, yeah, bring it on. Let's see. So let's see, as we go along, you can go ahead and type some of your thoughts in the chat box, and I'll try to see them as we go. So along these lines, my next slide is about how development needs to be an ongoing pursuit. It doesn't stop after your learners have left your supervisor development training retreat and you've cleaned up all the food. Development is an ongoing pursuit. And I will say it again, and we'll say it throughout this whole symposium. It doesn't stop with one event that you host every year or 2 years or 3 years or whatever. It doesn't stop when the supervisor leaves the classroom or logs out, or the person logs out of your e-learning platform. Here's next is a really great quote from one of the experts in your experts handout. She says, workplace training must be an ongoing conversation. It is almost impossible to solve a workplace challenge with a single training session, so supervisors must continually discuss their training needs and learning progress with their managers. And here's another one, Deetta Jones. I think the most effective approach is to offer regular planned development experiences that expect leadership to exist everywhere in the organization. It's important to create an organization with a growth mindset to support and to infuse supervisor development throughout the organization. And the point is here that this should not be a one-shot venture. What I'm getting to here, what I'm alluding to here, is something called a growth mindset organization. It's probably the best practice for supervisor development and any other development. But before I get into that and ask you a question about that, let's go over the annotation tools. And Jennifer, do you want to do that, or should I do that?
I will do that. If you advance the slide, I will talk through. So some of you may know that we like to use annotation tools to engage with you and keep you on your toes in as our audience. So I've given you all access to the tools, and I'm going to walk you through how to access them, and you can test them on this slide. If you go to the top left corner, you'll see a marker. Click on that marker, and then I want you to go halfway down the annotation tools to the square. Click on that square and go to the check mark that's under the square menu. So go a little bit further into the annotation options, find that square, and go to the check mark. Excellent. It looks like you're finding that check mark. And we'll be using this periodically throughout the session, so note that that's the way to find it. And now that you all have tested on this slide, Geraldine will ask you to pause your annotations, and we'll move to the next slide and have you answer her question on that slide. So let's go ahead and pause our tools. at this point.
And
go ahead.
Can I forward it now?
Well, I think you can, yes.
Okay, great. Okay, great, thank you. So let me get back to the growth mindset concept. Carol Dweck, you've probably heard of her. She's a researcher and she's a professor over at Stanford. And she's really written the definitive text on this. This one here on this slide is her trade book for the general public. And it's really excellent. Or you could Google her, I guess. She's got a great TED Talk, too, if you just want a little taste of her work. It's really worth looking at if you haven't already investigated her. She talks mostly about individual mindsets, but I think more about organizational mindsets. For me, a growth mindset organization has a culture of continuous learning. And so how do you know if you have that? You're looking at this continuum going, well, where do I put my check mark? Well, look at things like your hiring practices. Think about this. Do you hire for potential? Do you hire people who have the right attitudes, who've been innovative, who are curious, all those kinds of things? And if so, great. But if you hire people because they've done the job before or because they've demonstrated competence at doing the same thing you're hiring them to do, you might work in more of a fixed mindset organization, which is on the other side of the spectrum from the growth mindset organization. Another example is how often do you create new jobs and move existing employees into them, even though they may have no idea what the new expertise entails? You know, we do that constantly here. We've created dozens and dozens of new jobs over the years, and we typically move existing staff into these brand new roles. It's happened to me 4 times personally, but it's happened all over. We had a library assistant cataloger who's now a project manager of our brand new publishing department. We have an engineering library who is now our lead for a whole new area called Researcher and Discovery Systems. We have a physics librarian who's now leading our e-learning initiative. I could really go on and on and on. But these kinds of things are great examples of a growth mindset organization in operation. And so then you want to ask, well, what happens on the other side of that spectrum? What would a fixed mindset organization be doing? Well, they likely keep the same people in the same roles, doing what they're expert in for as long as they'll stay. And when, or if they do promote them into leadership, they'll expect that these individuals will get it on their own because they're smart, they're competent, and they probably wouldn't invest in supervisor development training or coaching or mentoring for these folks because they don't really need it. That's a fixed mindset organization. So you can see why some organizations are more apt to offer supervisor development and some organizations are less apt to do it. And much of it depends on the mindset of the leader and their team, where they are on the continuum. So you guys have been awesome putting in all your check marks, and it looks like we have people across the whole continuum, but it's so nice to see so many of the people on the yes side. We do still have a lot of people on the not at all side. Well, what if you are at that not at all side and you work in a fixed mindset organization and you need to be offering supervisor development programs? Those of you in the anywhere on the continuum, you feel free to type in what your advice would be in the chat box. And let's see, I'll take a stab at that here. So here's what I would do if I was at the not at all side here, the fixed mindset side. I would, and this is my advice for you, to see if you can sell a very basic traditional program, like like a typical standalone one-shot event. Maybe it's just a 2-hour session, or maybe it's a multi-day session, whatever you can get. And once people, if you can get that through, once people start to learn how much they don't know about supervision and management, you'll want to survey them. So right away, they walk out of that classroom and right away survey them. Ask them if they'd like to build on, what they'd like to build on. Ask them what they want clarification on. And then go pitch that to your leadership and what you believe would be a useful follow-up. And you can use what we'll be covering today in this symposium to craft a more tailor-made or custom-made solution for your organization, or if you're a consortium for your members. Let's see what else. I'm looking in the chat here. I'm a library director of a small college. I have 2 staff members who work at different times. Any suggestions? You're going to have to partner with other people in your same boat in your region if you have other small libraries in the region, or if you can broaden it out to your state and see if we can get the state level to provide some training if it's in person. Now, we're going to talk about alternatives to in-person during the rest of the session, and for many of you at small libraries, that's what you're going to probably have to do. Find an online solution or create an online solution so people can create community, be in community, but do it remotely and on their, and in many cases asynchronously. Yeah, Sandra reminds us that we'll be talking more about this in the 3rd session. Awesome. Okay, yep, 3rd session. So let's move on to the next point here, which is really understanding the techniques and the approaches that are going to work best for your particular learners in your particular organization, in your particular library type. Because I'll be talking a lot about generic things, but of course we need to figure out ways to customize that for your situation, or if you're from a consortium for your particular member community. So I'm going to spend a little time on that before we jump into specific techniques, and then I will get really specific and we'll talk about 10 specific best practices towards the end of this session. So understanding your learners, this is one of your handouts. The first thing we have to do, of course, is identify our learners. They might be brand new supervisors. They could be seasoned managers, mid-level leaders, or maybe a mixture of these. And I'm not going to go into that here, identifying your target learners. So if you have questions about this piece, do ask. I'm going to assume at this point that you've identified your target learners. And once you've done that, I'm going to go into kind of what do you do next. So here are some of the things you want to do. First, you want to kind of get clear on what you already know about your target learners. Like I mentioned before, are they brand new to supervision and they don't really know what that work entails beyond what they've observed from their own supervisors? Or are they seasoned managers who were promoted up from being competent, expert, subject matter experts, those kinds of types? Who are your target learners? Do you need to learn more about those target learners? Might you gather more information about your target learners through interviews or for reading or through focus groups? So if you do need to gather more information, you do need to understand them more before you tailor a program to them, here's some of the things you want to look for. Number 2, what are the characteristics of those target learners that may affect their learning? Okay, so what does that mean? For example, do they lack confidence, and might they be intimidated even by what you're covering? Or are they fairly savvy, and are they confident already? Are you going to need to simplify the content, or will they be able to deal with advanced concepts? Or do you have a mix? What kind of mix do you have? That's the kind of thing that you want to find out in number 2. In number 3, you're looking at what are their knowledge, what are their skills, and what are their attitudes that they already have about supervision that may affect their learning. So an example of attitudes, are they interested in management as a practice, or are they reluctant managers? Example of knowledge, let's see, so do they already know the value of performance management and the basic process, for example? In terms of skills, an example might be, can they have a development conversation? Are they practiced at it? Are they comfortable at it? So those are the kinds of things you want to look at in 3. And then in 4, you want to start investigating their learning preferences. And this is more of we could talk more about learning styles. Learning styles theory has been pretty much debunked, but there are still preferences that people do have. So what we want to assess out here is if they feel they learn best when, let's say, presented with a lot of content through lectures, or do they learn best by in-depth worksheets where they really get to puzzle something out on their own? Or do they learn best by an open laboratory experience? What approaches to learning work best for them? And you also want to find out here what might turn them off to learning. And this is all in your handout, by the way, so you can get to it there. including the part on the right, which is, well, how might you find that out? What questions might you need to ask or want to ask? And let's see, I've got, 8 questions here. You can borrow from those and put together a little interview or a little focus group at the end of a leadership meeting or a supervisor meeting or whatever. If you have ideas, if you've done that before, go ahead and put them in the chat box. I have done this quite a bit, so I can share too. Sometimes I just do a survey, but I find that the face-to-face discussions are much more rich. All right, so you're going to just have a ton of feedback after all this, just a ton of data. And you want to start thinking about those, putting those into 3 main buckets. So what are the learner characteristics? What is their previous knowledge, skills, and abilities? In other words, what are they coming to your learning with already? And then what are their style preferences? And then you might have a 4th bucket too that's sort of like miscellaneous stuff. So that's sort of the nuts and boltsy piece that you really kind of need to do before you jump into picking and choosing from a whole host of techniques. I'm gonna, let's see, I think I'm pausing next. Is that my, yes, I'm pausing here just to kind of take a breath, to look at the chat. Let's see if we have anything that I should respond to.
There's some great conversation going on, some suggestions for how external vendors, external training has been helpful, and there's been a great exchange. I love to see people asking for advice within the chat environment, so don't hesitate to do that. And please don't hesitate to post questions as they come to you.
Thank you. All right, so now what we're going to do with the rest of the time before the Q&A is to really dive into techniques that we will draw from. So what I'd like you guys to do is to think about the techniques or the approaches to supervisor development that you've either implemented for your staff or those you've experienced yourself in supervisor development programs. Some of you have already jumped in and talked about outside vendors, which is great. Another person, let's see, Carrie talked about Excellence in Leadership 1 and 2, which is the series that she offers. Great. So, so if you have, feel free. Many of you, like I said, have done these or you've been part of these. So go ahead and jump in and share yours as we go. Focus groups. Yes, brainstorming scenarios together as a small group. Yeah, I'll be talking about peer learning too as a really powerful way to, powerful technique to implement inside of a program or really even as a standalone aspect. Reading and discussion, yeah, reflection, contemplation. That was from Molly, thank you. A mentoring program, awesome. Okay, so we're going to be talking about a lot of these things. If you have experience or advice, I really encourage you to jump onto chat and share that with colleagues. Accountability through performance management process, yes, we are now big into that here at Minnesota as well. We do quite a bit of offer coaching as well from Cheryl. It's really, this is awesome, really good stuff. Okay, so let me dive into the, what is it now? I think it's 10 specific best practices that we have here, and you'll see how many of them overlap and reinforce each other. The first one I'm going to talk about here is the power of a professional development plan. Has anybody ever done a professional development plan? Use it in their training. Go ahead and jump on chat with that. It's really the one technique I'd strongly recommend before you provide any supervisor development, if you can. It's to have your supervisors complete a plan for themselves. Claudia Monte here recommends that people do this even if they're just considering management. She says, consider succession management in advance of need, and then says that should be part of a comprehensive professional development plan for those individuals. So rather they're already in the track or they're considering getting onto a management or supervisory track, professional development plans are an awesome tool. And I'm talking about using these prior to participation in any program or experience you're going to design, to have people really think deeply about what they'd like to develop and where they're going with their own careers. And whenever you can do anything to increase your learners' intrinsic motivation to participate, you're setting your learners up for much greater success than if they didn't come into the sessions or the program with that already. And I've got a link here to a collection of templates that I've been collecting so you can see how they vary and you can maybe adapt one that would work in your organization. We've had all our directors do this, and we've had 3 cohorts of non-positional leaders, people who we consider leaders but who aren't supervisors or managers, et cetera. They've also gone through individual development plans. Let's see, let me just look over here at, so people are piping in about that. We're beginning to think about that, said Cheryl. Thank you, Jennifer, for putting the link in there. We are working toward all employees having an IDP. An IDP, by the way, is the term for individual development plan. Professional development plan is basically the same thing. Most of the templates I gave you are probably called individual development plans. I used professional because Claudia used professional in her quote. I don't think it matters. Okay, so next piece of advice is to take a holistic approach. Management skills are developed on an evolving basis through awareness, learning, and reinforcement. We saw some of the people in the chat already kind of talk about this. Again, your supervisor development program will be much stronger if it looks more like an initiative. An initiative covers many levels and layers of the organization. So what do I mean by that? How might you achieve this? There are a number of ways. All levels of leadership would be coaching to the next level down. One-on-one meetings would include a segment during which the supervisor reflects on their management practice for the next week, what worked, what hasn't. Performance reviews, which was commented on in the chat, they would reinforce supervisor skills and practices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We'll have more examples of this as we go on in the symposium. The second quote here is just reinforcing that. If we don't do what we can to help our learners integrate their learning into daily practice, what is the point? Learning is change, and without change, one could argue that true learning hasn't occurred. This is one of my favorite, it's not like, it's a paraphrase, one of my favorite phrases from a book called, I'll have to get back to you on that. When teaching, training isn't saying, I think it is, but I'll have to get back to you on that. And somebody else says, my favorite general supervisory book is The Truth About Managing People by Stephen Robbins. Awesome, so we should look at that. Okay, the next technique that I'm going to talk about sort of builds on this, and it's about layering and learning. Here we go. And there's a great quote by Deetta Jones where she recommends we layer the approach to learning and include things like reflection time. Somebody brought that up in the chat window. Reflection time, small group interaction around the reflection or case study, large group exchange, and then the quote here from Deetta is, this ensures that everyone's preferred learning style will be covered at some point and allows for equitable contribution among participants. So layering the approach to learning. This next technique has more to do with content delivery, but it's the same idea. Use a variety of modes to deliver content. And Kimberly Sweetman here points out that different people respond differently to various training methods. We know that. But, you know, it's good to remember this, and it's good to really actively bring this into our program design. She says, quote, to create a culture of continual growth and learning that is meaningful to a variety of people, you will need to offer a variety of methods. And here are the ones she mentions in her section. The one-shot instruction sessions, we all have that one down probably, but she also talks about self-paced training modules. I don't know about you guys, but we're heavy users of lynda.com content. Our public library even has, we have a license at the university, but our public library even has a license to lynda.com online e-learning, basically very good quality work for managers. And I can talk a little later if you want to about how we've used that. She talks about, of course, in-person sessions, remote learning, and multi-session themed training. I'm a big fan of this. And in fact, I'm just starting another theme training on performance management that is kicking off next week. It's a 3-parter. The main message here with this technique is to intentionally switch it up. And again, I know we already know this intuitively, but it should be top of mind when we're designing our programs. Okay, next practice. We've already heard some folks advocating this in the chat, including a mentoring component into our programs. And this is such a great way to integrate new learning into daily practice, as we've already talked about. All candidates for supervisory positions, says Hilda Weisberg, as well as supervisors, should have a mentor with whom they can go to for advice. And then Kimberly Sweetman said, to integrate new learning into daily practice, mentoring conversations with managers, community of practice, and sessions with an external professional coach are all useful tools. Absolutely, and we have used all of those as well. Maybe some of you have as well. The next technique is to combine content experts with peer learning. Dieta advises us to build in lots of opportunities for participants to learn with and from one another, as well as a content expert. Kimberly is also a proponent of both formal and informal communities of practice so that supervisors can learn from each other. We do this quite a bit in my library. One of the things that I do is host a little brown box lunch every 6 weeks with the director level where they can have an informal community practice, basically. So they set the agenda, and I just facilitate the discussion and then take notes and decide, help with, like, follow-up action. It's a great informal community. We have a number of them here. As Dieta points out here, peer learning gives people the sense that they're not alone in their particular challenges, and I think that's what's so important about that lunch and other avenues that we give people to come together and talk. You're not alone, because it's very isolating being a supervisor. The people around you are not doing the same work you're doing necessarily. She also points out that peer learning can really boost confidence and build a sense of community. I can attest to that. And really, community might be one of the most important outcomes for people who feel like, again, they're pretty much working in isolation. All right, so not only do we want to provide opportunities for peer learning, we want to provide opportunities to practice, 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 practice. Hilda Weisberg here, she shared with us some real specific ways to do that. She was saying you could work into a program giving examples of reports generated by librarians about what they're doing, about their program, their area of their initiative, and if possible, show a 20 or 30-minute video of a librarian in action, and then have participants evaluate those and then discuss with each other how they would support or guide this librarian to improve their program. This is like a really great advice. Think about other ways you could work practice into your programs. An example from my library, after we had a number of managers go through a session on coaching, on development coaching for their employees, I offered a series of these small-scale sessions where managers could work together through a scenario that I gave them and kind of play out the role of supervisor and supervisee. And I can tell you from that experience that the majority of the learning happened not in that classroom, but in those follow-up practice sessions. Really powerful. Okay, next. Well, this one won't be a surprise to people. Provide in-person events, but it is kind of in the sense that we're moving to such an online community, a kind of approach to learning, so I thought this was still important to mention. Linda Bruno says that the delivery method for supervisory training should be based in part on the topic to be addressed. So we got to remember that. So for more reflective topics, such as those about things like emotional intelligence and creating a motivating environment, that these are the kinds of things that often work better in face-to-face situations and face-to-face workshops, the kind of things that allow for easier group discussion. Although she does, however, say that spreading out these kinds of topics over 2 or more days to allow participants to really fully digest the information is a best practice. It's not always possible for us to do that, but it is a best practice. Let's see, Dieta places a lot of value on in-person events too, because she thinks people, they do benefit tremendously from what she calls synergistic exchange. And Claudia Monte also spoke up about this, and she says that ideally a classroom setting allows for more interaction, for exercises, for demonstrations, and sharing of experiences. So this isn't like a shocker rule. Of course we know this, but I think what's really powerful about this is remembering that just because somebody's in the classroom doesn't mean that all you have to do is have a lecture. That the lecture is probably the least effective part of an in-person event, and all of these comments really have to do with interaction, exercises, sharing, exchanges. So make sure that we don't forget that when we design our in-classroom or face-to-face kinds of learning activities. Okay, we've got 2 more to go. The next one is providing blended learning events. Most of you probably know this. Blended refers to mixing up both in-person and the online learning. And Claudia Monte says that given, so true, given the challenges of libraries releasing staff, especially those of us in small libraries, a blend of webinar or online learning and classroom learning is probably more realistic, especially, if you just don't have backup or you can't justify a full day off-site for training. So let's think for a second about what kind of training works online. Linda Bruno, she characterizes some of these kinds of things as basic skill-based training. So like you're going to be focusing on organizational skills or delegation skills or skills for conducting effective meetings. Those are the kind of topics that she says could really benefit from face-to-face programs, but they also might be just as effective in an online environment. So really be discerning for X topic, which would be the better approach, and then of course, which is the approach that we have to take because we have other restrictions or limitations. Hilda Weisberg also talked about this. She says that even if most of your training is done online, it's still a good idea to have at least one face-to-face, although this could be done on Skype or whatever the equivalent of that. She also says that it works well if participants can have I think she calls it a reunion of sorts after X amount of months or so to identify what's working and what isn't. So Hilda's basically saying if you do the majority of your program online, still have a face-to-face or an aspect of that program where people get to come together in community. Learning reunions are the best, Jennifer. Reflective learning is so important, right? Okay, so our last technique for the session is incorporating experiential learning whenever you can. This is a picture here of our storage facility. It's built into the side of the Mississippi River bank. And you can see here someone who's in training to drive this lift. She's going around this cone. And it's such a great example of how you need experiential learning opportunities to really get to internalize what you're learning. Claudia Monte, again, she recommends that sessions be scheduled with a 2-week or longer break in between. And that allows participants time to really apply the skills that they've learned. And then when they return, their experience should be discussed at the beginning of each subsequent session. It makes the learning real for them, she says. Now, the way I've worked this into our management training is by very intentionally crafting email messages to the supervisors of the participants prior to each session, and I tell them what we'll be covering in the session and give them specific discussion questions for either their management teams if they have them or their one-on-one meetings with their supervisors who are participating in the training. And so I don't leave this to chance. I actually give them questions to ask and ask them to talk about how ask them to ask their supervisors to talk about how they've applied the learning in their day-to-day work. And so I encourage you, don't leave these kinds of discussions up to chance. If you can do exert any kind of influence to make sure that people are actually getting outside of the sessions to experience and put into, to apply what they're learning, that is just awesome. And often it's the supervisor of that person who really kind of helps to motivate them to actually do it and not just sort of shelve the training materials in a pile or something. Okay, so we've talked about cultivating a growth mindset in your organization. We've talked about integrating development into the everyday fabric of your organization, and we just talked through 10 real specific techniques to use when creating your supervisor development programs. I'm gonna let's see. I'm gonna ask you a question now. Here's the annotation tool. Ask you a question now that has that will have you use this again. So hopefully you remember that you go to the upper left-hand corner of your screen and you pick that little pencil paintbrush, and that's how you get into the annotation tools. If you're having trouble with that, just go ahead and put something in the chat.
And feel free to practice again if you want to practice on this slide before we move forward for folks to find that little check mark. And I'll mention on the next slide, we have carefully defined boxes for you to check in. So hopefully that will help folks know where to check. And I encourage you to find the smaller check mark. Use the smaller check mark if you're able to. It's underneath the box that is on the middle of your annotation tool panel. So go to the middle of your panel and find the square and then scroll down to the check mark. Okay.
Okay, thank you. All right, if you guys could just hold up on your practice, I'm going to advance the slide. Okay, so stop the practice. I still see little check marks coming up because they'll just go on the next slide in like a random place. Okay, so I'm advancing the next slide. Here are the techniques that I just covered. Let's see, we've got a double one. Well, there are 10 techniques. Sorry, the numbering went off a little bit. So if you can think back to what we talked about, what do you think are the two most important ones? Experiential learning is a big one. Professional development plans, awesome, wow. I didn't know that those were so popular in libraries. Opportunities to practice. Mentoring is a big one. So you've only got 2 check marks. Again, professional development plans is really coming up to the top. And experiential learning. Okay. So if you're going to prioritize all of these, you got a sense of what your 2 priorities are if you can't do everything. And are you done with your checks? Thank you. Well, Jennifer, will we have this as part of the record? This will be in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And,
cool.
Yep.
All right. Excellent. All right, so I'm advancing the slide here. Okay, so here's just a little bit of overview of what we covered. We talked about why supervisor development is so important. We talked about the importance of creating an organization with a growth mindset. We talked about understanding your learners and designing your programs around their needs and preferences. And then finally, we talked a lot about the best practices for approaches to supervisor development. Whew, we did it. I'm going to open up for questions in a minute, but let me just say, or you go ahead and think about your questions and put them in the chat box. But I just want to say while we're waiting for that, that we do have the next session that starts quarter after the hour. And in the next session, we're going to be looking at at actual supervisor development programs. Okay, so real ones that have been implemented that you can then kind of look at and pick and choose maybe what will work for you, what you can adapt. And we're going to, like I said, we're going to start that at quarter after the hour, but we do have a little bit of time here if anybody has any questions, and I think the other panelists might be looking at these questions too, if you have any, and we'll be jumping in. Oh, before I pause and look at the chat box, there is a link here on this Q&A page that goes to a survey, and this survey is designed to assess your interest in a follow-up to this symposium. So after every one of the sessions, we're going to show this link. We're proposing that the next thing we might do is create small teams you guys who would actually create an element of a supervisor development program for your own constituents. So that's kind of the proposal that's out there. If that sounds interesting, go ahead and take a look at this link and fill out that survey when you get a chance. In the meantime, let's look at the chat window and see if there's anything here.
Yeah, there's some really great questions actually coming through, and I know we're going to be covering some of this again in later sessions, but I love this question about advice for new, very young supervisor whose staff is all off-site and also much older. Can you talk about how to address that both with the culture of learning in your library staff, but also for that supervisor?
Yeah, I would say that learning how to do some coaching would probably be really important here. However, I would do that gingerly, because sometimes coaching from a younger, more inexperienced staff member does not go over well. So in all cases, if I were in your position, I would be inviting my staff to participate with me and kind of offer this as a possibility. You're going to be then having to deal with, if you're going to do any kind of, so your staff, let me just make sure, you're a supervisor of not of supervisors, but of staff here. And that's my guess. Is that true? Mm-hmm. Is this Jenna? Okay, that's right, yeah. I would also do, and do you meet online? Do you have staff meetings online? No. Okay, I'm trying to think about any kind of off-the-shelf e-learning that I've seen on this topic, and I haven't, because we don't have this issue. I'm just kind of going through the lynda.com content. A lot of what you're going to need is probably individual coaching and support. So back where Kimberly Sweetman said, you know, one of the great things to do for your own development is to hire a coach. If you can get the funds to do that, that would be great. We do that regularly for our new supervisors. We give them experienced coaches who work with them on their individual issues and work through those issues one by one with them. So if that's possible, because I just don't think of anything, I can't think of anything off the shelf, or I can't think of anything that's sort of pre-done that you could go to even in person for this situation. So I would say get some support. And you have a list of wonderful people in the experts packet who may all actually be available for one-on-one work if you can get the funding for that.
Absolutely, and I'd also encourage others that are gathered here today, if things come to mind, feel free to chime in there. There was a great question, and these are kind of a good pair of questions. One is, you talked about reluctant managers as people who maybe don't see themselves as moving into those management positions. How do you address that, and are there particular strategies for reluctant learners?
Yeah, I think first you need to make it real for them. So one of the first things we did was we took there used to be one line on our position descriptions that said something about your supervisory responsibilities, one line. And we busted that out and made it a substantial section of the position description. Now, we use position descriptions every year in our performance reviews. So you pull them out, you look at them, you say, well, how well did I do meeting my position description, the bullets on that. And so it becomes very real to people very quickly when those descriptions, those specific elements of a supervisor's responsibility are delineated on a job description that then gets used in a performance review. So that makes it very real very quickly. But you can't do that without making sure that these folks have those fundamental skills. So what we did was after we offered a supervisor fundamental series, we took what we learned from the supervisor fundamentals and we basically baked that into the job description. So we weren't pulling things willy-nilly. We were really pulling all those skills, the kinds of, what does it look like when you're a good supervisor from the supervisory, the fundamentals training. We pulled those things into the job description. So people knew, if they didn't know how to do something, they knew they could go to their materials, they could talk to a colleague about what they remembered, and they would have the resources to help them, to make sure that they're going to be successful. So that's a big one for me. Did anybody else jump in and say anything else?
Yeah, well, the other question that I'd love to hear, you know, I know that oftentimes in organizations there really maybe isn't any opportunity for advancement. The roles that are defined are you know, the ones that exist for, especially for smaller organizations. Many of our folks come from smaller and rural libraries. So I just, I want to give a plug for, you know, I'm a real advocate for the idea of the organization being one in which they're learning together. You know, I even talk about leadership as a subversive activity, that we're really growing leadership amongst all of those roles. So I don't know, in terms of how you bring sort of that idea of learning development, professional development to the organization. Can you talk a little bit about how you would maybe compensate for that lack of movement, places to move into, and how you address that?
Okay, so the ladder doesn't go up, but does the ladder go sideways? So one of the things that we started doing even before this that I think changed the culture is we started giving people lead roles. So they retain their job as a reference librarian or as an engineering librarian or as an ILL coordinator. They retain their main jobs, but we figured out ways to give them programs or projects that help to develop them. So many of us, I mentioned earlier that we've created new jobs, new programs, new departments, and I mentioned that I've done actually all my jobs, all 5 of my jobs were brand new. No one had done them before. But in all the cases, after I got into my first job, it was because I expanded my role in a new area, you know, within the job that I had. So I'm very much an advocate. When I was a department head, I was very much an advocate of finding ways to help people have stretch roles in new areas and start building things within their jobs. So, you know, how to get some backup to them, how to provide some support while they're doing that. So at least, you know, they had a possibility of having a new title, or, you know, in many cases, like in my case, we were able to go to the provost and create a new funding stream, and I actually was able to hire a couple new positions, not that we funded internally in the libraries, but that were funded at the university level. So every once in a while, those kinds of things happen where we're able to make a case and argue for a whole new position or a whole new area, because somebody has stretched out of their job and taken on a new project or a new role that just kind of grew out.
Fantastic. I'm so excited because this is the one thing that happens when we do a multiple session event is that we've just barely scratched the surface, but we still have 2 more sessions. So I want to thank you, Geraldine, for bringing us into this, into the scope of what we can talk about today. Your 10 approaches are excellent ways to explore bringing this kind of training to your communities. So I'll, at that, thank you, and let folks know that we're going to take a short 15-minute break. Be sure and stand up and walk around, and hopefully you can come back in 15 minutes, and we'll begin our next session at 15 minutes past the hour. Thank you so much, Geraldine.